Welcome to the Electric Monks podcast. Ballistic interrogation tape number 5, Chris Ryall.
Hello, one and all, and welcome to a very special edition of the Electric Monks podcast. We've got a very, very special guest today. It is a man with many, many comic books behind him, including, of course, this little number from 10 years ago. Dirk Gently's Let's Take the Vacancy, the Interconnectedness of All Kings, the very, very first Dirk Gently comic as it happens. And it is, of course, the one, the only, Mr. Chris Ryall. Chris, welcome to the podcast. It's lovely to have you. Looking forward to getting into it because, of course, this is a long time ago and you've done a lot of work since then.
Yeah, thank you. Happy to be here. And I am kind of amazed and dismayed that it's been 10 years already since the Dirk comic launched.
Exactly, yeah. It's amazing. Still, a lot of people don't know about it in the Dirk Gently fandom, which is another reason to do this as well. So let's talk about you and comics because it's been a long association, a love affair, one might say. How did you get into it in the first place, Chris?
I mean, the same way pretty much anybody does is as a fan. As a kid, I remember, I was 4 or 5 years old, and one of my neighbors had copies of comics laying all over their floor when I was over there playing. So there was an old issue of Fantastic Four that just completely grabbed me and never let go. So yeah, sort of been into them from the start as soon as I could read, and then when working in the business now for just over 2 decades.
Wow, it
Yeah.
never really stopped, did it? So because obviously you were quite high up in the comic book industry. You're president of IDW for quite a few years, and you've done a number of comics. Do you want to tell us a little bit about how that came about, or do you want to get straight into sort of how you got involved writing Dirt
Yeah,
Gently?
no, happy to I started there in 2004. I was the company's second editor in chief. And I started as editor in chief, but there was only 6, 7 employees. So I was editor in chief, but I was also the sole editor, and handled all the marketing and PR. And so you just kind of did a little bit of everything at that point. As the company grew and sort of got bigger and more staffed up, I took over as chief creative officer, and sort of those two roles were the bulk of my time at IDW. I left for about a year, went to Skybound for a year, came back to IDW, and they offered me to take over as president and publisher. But it was always the editor in chief and chief creative officer, the person running the publishing and editorial direction of the company. That was always my sweet spot.
Yeah, some people like to be up above in sort of upper management, and other people like just getting stuck in on the creative side. So,
You
it,
start getting pulled farther and farther away from the things you want to do as you go along, or the things that you're good at doing. And so yeah, that was always those roles were always, like I say, where I preferred to be.
So let's sort of figure out the timeline here. So mid 2010s, you get involved writing this first ever Dirt Gently comic. How does that come about? Did Arvin, Ethan, David, and company approach you, or was it the other way around?
So at that point, IDW had started a entertainment division a couple years prior to that. Sort of building on the success of things like 30 Days of Night. Um, and we'd optioned a number of other projects, like My Zombies versus Robots ended up at Sony, and there were a lot of projects that sort of got optioned and went through the development process and then came to nothing, which happens quite often in the entertainment world. And so the owners of the company at the time wanted to have a little bit more control over, trying to see their productions through. And so they started an entertainment division, not only to develop our own stuff for TV and film, but also potentially to bring in other projects, and Dirk Gently was one of those. Yeah, I don't even recall where we first got to know Arvind, but yeah, Arvind, was sort of managing the Douglas Adams properties, and so Dirk Gently was one that we all identified as something that had a ton of merit, not only as a comic property but potentially as TV too, because it had never really sort of been elevated in the same way that other properties of Adams is, like Hitchhiker's Guide certainly. And so it felt like a good one that had name recognition but wasn't so ingrained in people's minds that we couldn't, maybe have some fun with it and do something a little bit different.
Yeah, I remember when I interviewed Arvin, what he said was that I asked, why did you do comics first? He said, well, we get the comics made quicker than the TV show, which is certainly true.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Because, of course, this
Yeah.
predates that show that ended up happening by a whole year. So I've got a question about how you prepared writing for it, and another one that's sort of linked in with that, which is how much creative freedom you had. It does sound like rather a lot, and sort of was the original intention when you were making this that it would tie into the TV show, which obviously a lot of things were still being planned and changing up in the air at the time. So it sounds like, from what I know, a very, very fluid sort of process.
Yeah, and so the TV show had a plan, and then that plan, by the time the show came to fruition, completely changed. But that initial plan, which was to have Dirk come over from England and be relocated to San Diego,
It was San
um,
Diego, yeah. It ended up being changed to
yeah, and
Seattle, I think, in the final product.
right, right. And so the original plan was set in San Diego. So then we said, okay, well, let's set the comic in San Diego. We had certain ideas of casting that we thought was going to go in a different direction than the show ended up going. And so the location and the sort of general appearance of the character were what was initially envisioned. But beyond that, beyond the setting, there was really no parameters in place. There was no, backstory at that point of how you to get Dirk from England to San Diego and what happened once he was in San Diego. And so I was given full freedom to, just develop that in whatever way made sense to me.
Oh, that is interesting. The comment that you
Yeah.
thought somebody else was going to be cast as Dirt rather than Sam Barnett, because obviously that was very, very early days back then. And I think Sam has gone on record in some interviews that I've heard where he's like, I wasn't quite sure what they wanted at first, I think was Sam's roughly the quote that I can remember.
Yeah, which
So
I think was kind of you across the board. We didn't know what we wanted, and you often don't know what you want until you get it, or until you find like the right person in Sam. With Sam, just sort of seemed to embody like the spirit of this version of the character. But yeah, initially it was more of like, well, let's cast him more along the lines of his appearance in the novels, and
mm,
just go from there.
yeah, because that was sort of the source. That was all you really had to work on basically at the time, other than the Stephen Mangan miniseries in the UK that had briefly been on TV a couple of years before, which I grew
Yeah,
up
which
with.
I
So.
deliberately didn't watch. I think all of us kind of deliberately didn't want to pay attention to that for fear of it influencing too much what we were trying to do. So, not only did I stay away from that, but when you ask about my research for the comic, my research was, reading those Dirk Gently novels 10, 15 years prior, but I didn't want to go back and revisit them directly because again, I thought, well, I don't want to try to like the worst thing I could do is try to emulate too closely, the voice and the spirit of, well, the voice anyway of Douglas. And so I didn't want to be overly influenced by that. I wanted to kind of try to channel his spirit and sort of the madcap, but also the very clever way that he, introduced all these disparate elements in the books, and then they all tied together in such a brilliant way. I didn't want to try to do a knockoff, and so I kind of deliberately stayed away from revisiting anything too directly and just went by my sort of lingering impressions because I thought that feels more true to Douglas and to the character than to, like I say, try to do something that was too much of a direct copy.
Okay, so there's two things I want to sort of circle back on that we mentioned. The one is that in fact this isn't something we mentioned, but it is in the comic and it did sort of get carried through, which was Dirk wearing the yellow jacket, which was sort of something that the TV series also did. And I was wondering because I don't remember that being mentioned in the story Bible anywhere. Did that come from anywhere in particular?
God, I want to say it came from the novels. I think there was a mention of a yellow jacket,
I
but
think
like
there's
I
a
say, it's
mention of
been.
like a red hat and he has a sort of
Oh
green
yeah,
vest
yeah,
and
yeah, yeah.
vaguely red sort of jacket was what I remember.
Yeah, and so to some degree, when originally it was Tony Akins, was the
Hmm.
original artist on the series, and so it was, again describing the character as he appeared in the book, and then giving him also the freedom to kind of develop an outfit that felt right to the character in his mind and felt right visually, and so yellow jacket is always a very distinctive visual thing, going back to Dick Tracy
Hmm.
or further. And so, yeah, it just felt fitting that this guy who was already so sort of out of place in San Diego would even dress out of place.
Yeah, and I do like at one point there's a brief scene where I think Dirk trades the jacket for like a hoodie to escape a
Yes.
drone,
Yeah.
and then
Yeah.
then of course he gets shot. It's brought back to life, and then the first thing he does is, right, I want my jacket back now.
Yeah. Right.
Uh, um, the other thing I wanted to go back to the choice to set it in San Diego, because not only was that in the storyboard, but that obviously plays into it because, of course, you've lived in San Diego for quite a big stretch of your life now. You know the area very well, and there's a lot of real life locations that Dirk and company visit in the car. You can get a map out and you can say, like, the Hotel Del Coronado. There's a, I don't think the tea shop is a real place, but
Oh, it
most of the other
absolutely
places
is.
are.
Yeah.
Oh, it is.
The,
Okay.
the the tea shop is a real place that actually was God, it was like a quarter mile from where I lived when I first moved to San Diego. I moved down to San Diego from Los Angeles. And so that was the place I used to be able to walk to. And so I just did that kind of as a nod to I wasn't living in that neighborhood at the time I wrote the comic, but I always remembered liking it. And I just thought it had a cool, distinctive design to it. And so, because it was basically just an big old house that had been converted to a coffee shop. And so that felt like a fitting place to set the location. And again, it was one of those things where, like, I've reading comics my whole life. Comics are either set in fake cities or they were set in like a New York that I'd never been to and didn't know from. And so I always wanted to see locations that were more directly set in areas where I lived. And so I thought, well, now I have a chance. We didn't set it, Dirk, in San Diego because the company was based there, but it was more of like, at the time, I think there were, tax incentives. There were reasons that the show was going to try to be set there rather than even in LA, which didn't come to pass. But that was the original thinking. Like, it wasn't an egocentric thing of like, let's set it near IDW. But since we happened to be there, I thought, well, I should go around and, use real locations. And then I can also have the benefit of taking, lots of good pictures as photo reference for the artist too.
Wow, okay. So yeah, I'm definitely getting an education, even more of an education than
Yeah.
the comic gave me about San Diego landmarks. So you mentioned obviously Tony Akins started writing the first two
Yeah.
issues, and then I think about halfway through they changed artists to Ilyas Kiriazis, wasn't it? Who ended up doing the rest
Yes.
of the
Uh-huh.
run, a lot of the Arvind written issues as well.
Yeah.
Was there a particular reason for that? Was it just sort of uh the art direction wasn't working for whatever reason? Was there any sort of specific reason, or did Tony just have to end up having to
Just
do something else?
yeah, I think it was that. It was, it's a challenging business for a lot of people, and so a lot of times you take on multiple jobs at the same time, and so sometimes the deadlines just eat you up. And we're doing monthly comics, and so there's a little bit of leeway at times, but not that much. And so when Tony just wasn't able to meet the pace of the book, he bowed out, and so we went to Ilias, who I think did a great job, not only kind of emulating Tony's style, but also bringing in his own style, and just was very good at kind of the surreality of the story too. And so that's why I know Arvin really liked. In fact, he's still working with Ilias now on some
Yeah, Raymond
detective
Chandler
novels that
stuff,
he's
isn't it? Yeah.
yeah, the Chandler stuff he's been doing as graphic novels. And so Ilias was really just the kind of perfect fit for the story we were trying to tell. I mean, Tony was great too, but I was really happy with where things ended up with Elias because you make a switch halfway through in a miniseries, it can sometimes get derailed
Hmm.
visually, and so I thought this one not only had cohesiveness to it, but Elias kind of even more hit the kind of tone that we were looking for.
Yeah, it's interesting when you go from part two to three, and there's a couple of things that I don't think it's necessarily the art direction that causes it, but like the hotel receptionist that they meet in part two is quite
Mm.
friendly to the Susan, Hamish, and Crowther, the three that go visit, and then
Yeah,
when Dirk sees her, she's like ice cold. Obviously, that's after everything's gone to hell in the hotel,
yeah, yeah.
and then there's other things like I think in part two. Bill, was one of the copycat serial killers, he says to
Yeah.
his wife, I'm going to go. We see Susan leaving, I'm going to go get my bag now. And then we see him again at the end of part three. Not only has he not gotten the bag, and he's like holding Dirk at gunpoint, saying, "Can I have my bag back now?" So clearly he tried to get in the front door, found it was locked, and just went back
Yeah.
to the coffee shop for the rest of that part. So it's not inconsistent, but I find little things like that where a character confidently declares they're going to do something and then takes a whole other chapter to do it. It's just sort of, it
Yeah,
happens in
yeah.
comics all
And
the time, but that's quite fun.
right. And there's always a bit of us hoping that readers can kind of fill in the gaps between the panels too at times. So, because otherwise you end up spending too much time on travel or sort of mundane things. And we had, I felt like this story was threatening to spiral out of control the entire time
Mm.
with all the different pieces and parts. Like I say, Douglas was a master at weaving those things together. And I definitely felt the sweat of trying to make sure that all these different things that were introduced kind of paid off properly and sort of came together in the end, which I don't know how successful I was, but I feel like, I at least did my level best to emulate what Douglas was doing, but also make it very much its own thing. Like this one, I'll admit Dirk is a bit more of a, I don't know, passenger, whereas in the books he's maybe a bit more of a direct catalyst. In the events kind of cohering in the end. But yeah, I don't know. I like I said, it was fun to kind of pick a bunch of pieces, throw them up in the air, and then try to catch all of them and bring it together at the end.
Yeah, I think there's definitely an element in the comic where he's more, because there's such a huge team of assistants that he gets landed with almost immediately, that he's more trying to push them all into various different directions. And then the group gets
Yeah,
even bigger
yeah.
when you have Kate Cheshire who arrives, and for some reason is a CIA agent, which always felt a little odd to me, but he's sort of, I guess, the role of it. And then you get Craig who joins, who's a hilarious character. I love Craig because he's just so
Well, it's
chilled
funny, and
out.
that was the thing with when the TV show was intended to make her an FBI agent, and so there were a couple of little things like that that kind of influenced,
Oh, okay.
things we did in the comic, but that didn't then come to pass in the show. And so, again, when you try to get out too far in front of shows that are constantly evolving and changing as they're developed, you kind of run the risk of having things that obviously are different than the way they ended up, but that's okay.
Well, that's interesting because again, that was something I didn't really know because obviously I remembered Kate from Long Dark Tea Time where she's one of the main
Yeah,
characters of
yeah.
that, and she's a journalist, so it's and the comic even Dirk even mentions it. Wow, it's a bit of a massive career change. I think he says at one point. So
Yeah, it doesn't make a ton of sense, but then we thought, well, yeah, like with comics, one thing comics does well is filling in gaps and
hmm.
telling backstories and side stories. So if we ever get to a point of telling sort of how she got from, journalism into law enforcement, thought that could have been a fun story to delve into.
Yeah.
But, you know,
Yeah, I think towards the end of there's a line that says, "Oh, I'm still at a very junior level," she says, or something like that. So,
yeah,
like, I can't afford to screw up. So that's a considered
yeah,
cover of, "Oh, she recently joined," so it's okay. This
right.
hasn't happened. We haven't cut to like 3 or 4 years after all the novels, but
Yeah, she's not a seasoned agent by any means.
hmm.
Yeah.
um. So, do you remember any of the notes or feedback you got from Arvind or John Barber, who both served as like the editors, obviously, when you were writing this?
So the funny thing is I mean, it's weird when like I'm the editor in chief of the company, but then I have an editor on staff editing. I always got the sense that they were sort of afraid to give too many notes, and I was like, no, 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 bring on your notes. Like, if there's things that I did wrong or that can make the story better, please. But so I mean, Barbara definitely had a light touch on it, but there, like, he suggested some sound effects actually, which I thought was a lot of fun. Like when they are on that party bus, on the way to
The hotel,
the
isn't it?
Hotel del Coronado. He goes, well, this would be a cool sound effect for like that kind of thumping electronic music that was probably, that's always playing on those things when you see him down by the beach. And I thought it was like the perfect sound effect. But yeah, he didn't really have any structural thoughts or changes. And Arvind, I think, was forever pushing to have the story kind of connect a bit more. I don't know, even more sort of Adams like than it maybe did, which, he was very specific about that in the Dirk comics that he wrote afterwards. His stuff very much adhered even more to kind of the structure of a Douglas book. But yeah, like I say, I wanted this to really be its own thing and not feel like it was trying to overly copy or emulate what had come before.
Yeah, I think there's definitely huge advantages to that, and that you've got control of it, and you're not constantly trying to think, well, this is good, but oh, what would Douglas think of this? Instead of sometimes you do have to go with your own creative voice a little bit more. Sometimes, well,
Yeah.
otherwise you may as well just do a remake of the two novels, essentially.
Well,
So
and I
there's
think
always a
if
bit
you
of
let,
debate about that, I guess.
yeah, I mean, if you let Douglas get in your head, it can just totally ruin you. Like when I remember first reading the Dirk book and going, well, I don't really get this at the start, and I don't understand where this is going. This, and then you get to the end, and you're like, God, that was one of those masterful weaving together of wildly disparate plot lines into a satisfying finale that I'm like, if I even try to kind of have that in my head, like I'm never going to measure up to what Douglas did. And so the best thing I can do is, like I say, try to capture the spirit and feel of the characters and the situation, but not try to make it a carbon copy of what he did.
Yeah, I seem to remember in the forward to the big volume, Arvin says something about you. What was it? Revving his brain up to a dangerous heat to simulate Douglas's, I think was the exact words he said. Which,
Yeah, which is probably Arvin's polite way of saying, well, I'm going to do more of a Douglas than Chris delivered in the first book. So, because he is like he's very connected to the
that's true. He used
Adams
to work
estate,
for
and
Douglas as well back in the day.
yeah, and so as sort of the keeper of the flame, I know it's very important to him to be as true to Douglas in all ways as possible, which is great and how it should be. But yeah, like I said, I want to do something that got close, but wasn't trying to get too close.
So let's talk a little bit about some specific. Can you share any details from because the very beginning kind of promises a doozy of a story to come, and it's been 10 years, so I think it's fair to ask sort of what went down in this version of the story at St. Sed's that forced Dirk to flee the UK altogether. Because Kate knows about it, Dirk doesn't tell anyone about it, and they just don't talk about it at all.
Well, what's annoying about not being able to sort of delve into that and this other stuff that we planned to do at the time was we don't know. Like when Arbor and I talked about it, it was like, okay, well, let's make sure when we do tell this that it's a doozy of a story, and we'll figure out all the specifics. Because again, it was kind of like, well, that story might be a thing that threads into the TV series, so let's wait on that. So we deliberately didn't get too far ahead of thinking about what that story itself would be, other than that it needs to be something big and outlandish. But we didn't really scribble down any notes at that point. It was just more of like, if we're able to do this, then let's all plot it together. And at the time, like that was when Max was coming on board and getting into figuring out the show Bible and all of that. And so I think the idea was that he would have some input there. And so yeah, like I said, we didn't really outline anything because it was going to be a thing that sort of came out of wherever the TV show ended up. Um, Especially if she became a character on the show and all of that. So we didn't put any effort toward it because, like I said, the plan was to do that when we could and when it felt right. But never got to tell that one.
Yeah, I think Arvin made his comics sort of. I think the very beginning of Spoon Too Short says, "Oh, this is set before Kings," so you could maybe say because I think the end of the comics has like Dirk and Sally Mills making out in a gondola, so maybe that's how he got kicked out. I don't know. It seems a bit, it seems a bit of a stretch, but I guess you can maybe get the two knots together because
And
but
there would have been more in between that
hmm.
went even worse for Dirk. But yeah, like I said, that was one that we were hoping to be able to tell, but just didn't get to it.
Yeah, it reminds me of a lot of movies where like there's like a scam or a con gone wrong and the main character's trying to run away and then we never find out what it is that
But it
actually
had to be something really scandalous if
exactly
he
yes.
had to actually flee the country. Yeah,
And then there's also teasers at the end of the story. In particular, there's the ending where Craig is about to fade out of existence, and then Mr. Bird, the mysterious guy who catalyst of the story, comes
yeah.
along and offers to take Craig with him, and he promises that they'll meet again. And Dirk is quite keen to hold him to account for basically setting up soul-stealing phones and causing a whole bunch of chaos. Although I suppose technically the
Yes.
phone is used to save Dirk's life, so maybe it sort of swings and roundabouts, I guess. But was there, again, I imagine you're going to say we were going to make something up later, but was there ever a resolution in mind for how they go? Was Dirk going to put Mr. Bird on trial somehow in The Hague? I don't
I
know.
mean, I not necessarily anything specific. I just like the idea of Mr. Bird, being an immortal that might allow us to play with different timelines and not necessarily just have to be totally linear. But so again, yeah, it was more of like as this one was ending, Arvin was planning to do the next one, and then the thinking was that, well, we'll figure this out together, and so that together story just never came to pass. And so again, like, yeah, I never want to get too far in these things because I've done this long enough that I know that the best laid plans often come to naught, and so didn't want to put too much thought into it because it was like I say that was initially going to be a third miniseries, and then just yeah, it didn't get there, but I certainly plan to, and like I had a lot of fun with those characters, all the different new characters in the series, and I would have loved to do more with Mr. Bird and just kind of play with that whole cast that we developed and how we left things at the end of the book.
Yeah, there's definitely a sense that that because they even I think Hamish even sort of underlines that Susan who's Tanya's partner, of course, is just a bit of a well, she was there too, there's a line later they get her to destroy the drone at the end, but other than that she doesn't have a whole lot to do from like midway through the story other than being
Right.
a
Yeah.
little bit skeptical of Dex. There's sort of hints that well, these characters being introduced, they can be developed a bit more later on is the sort of sense I got reading it, because you give so many characters, there's only so many pages in the comic and so much plot to get
Yeah.
through. Yeah.
And that's always the fun part about a sequel is then you're able to take a character that didn't necessarily get fully developed at first and then take them in a different direction or make them more of an elevated part of a next series. And I don't know, I just like the idea of a full team of characters that didn't necessarily want to be together, you know, being together, which I just thought was a fun dynamic in general to play with.
Yeah, definitely. Dirt Journey is a great opportunity to have like dysfunctional
Yeah.
people joining him that he
Yeah.
selects
Yeah.
almost specifically due to their dysfunctionality. Um,
Exactly. Yeah.
and was it always planned that it was going to be 5 parts and then Arvin would take over? Because I believe at the start Arvin was being taught sort of how to do comics because he'd never done any before at that point. So he definitely
Yeah, and he was
did have that in
also
mind, didn't he?
yeah, I mean, I know he wanted to do it. He probably would have wanted to do the first one just because again, like he Arvin, thinks he has and probably has the best handle on Douglas's properties of just about anybody. And so if he wasn't subsequently trying to develop the TV show at the same time, I think he probably would have wanted to launch the comic just because that would have allowed the comic and the show maybe to have even more specific kind of parallel paths. But he was busy over there, and so I really wanted to take a crack at this one, and so yeah, I did the first one, but it was mostly like a setup, and then he was going to run with it from there. But I kind of thought, that he might use the characters and the situations and the setting that we developed in this one and spin out from there. But like you say, he said his story in the past, and so these characters kind of still just sitting there waiting for their next close up.
Yeah, and it's interesting that there are things in there that you can sort of tell end up being used by the TV. Like at one point early on, before Kate shows up, there are these two cops that show up that they're never named, but I call them not Estevez and not Zimmerfield because those are the cops I think
Right.
that are used, yeah, and they're sort of the more incompetent sort of prototype versions. But it's not it's interesting to see sort of what ends up being a sort of throwaways. And there's a bit seemed very similar to one in the first episode where they come across the chaotic scene in a museum, and then the CIA agents and the police are arguing about jurisdiction and pointing guns at each other while Dirk is searching around mummified
Yeah.
corpses or whatever. And that felt to me very, very much like something they also used again in the show. So uh, that's kind of cool to see.
I like
Yeah.
to think it yeah, it fed into the spirit of the show. I have no idea if Max ever read the comics or not. I don't know.
I'm pretty sure he did because he answered a lot of. I
Eh,
remember answering fan questions, thinking, "Oh, I had something different and planned that I was going to do," and then the show got cancelled. As it turns out, probably for reasons to do with Max, as we know. But
yeah, I was gonna say the show got canceled before he did.
yeah, oh yeah,
Yeah.
that's certainly the case. So just because we're running a bit short on time, if Arvin came to you and asked you today to write a new Dirk Gently comic, and you had like four options to do, would you choose a sequel to Kings with Dirk and the Gumshoe and Tea Leaves team, a continuation of the show set after the second season, where when it got cancelled, of course, would you like to do a tie-in comic to the animated series that Arvin is supposedly getting off the ground? So it'd be similar
Hmm.
to this, or you're figuring it out as you go, or would you like a sort of clean slate reboot of set after the Dirk novels? Which of those sounds the
I,
most interesting to you?
I mean, if it was totally up to me, so I would tell the story of Dirk leaving England, coming to San Diego, and it would also have relevancy to a story that would take place after Kings. So it would be a sequel and a prequel all together, where past events influence the future events, and then they would all sort of wrap together.
Wow, amazing. I hope you get to do it one day, but
Yeah.
I guess it's a sort of wait and see thing, isn't it? You've got so much else going on as well. Do you want to talk about some of the non-Dirk things that you're doing? Because obviously you've been doing, I think, a lot of work with not just your own series that you talked about. Was it Robots versus Zombies, wasn't it, earlier? Which is obviously won a lot of awards over the years. But there's also some stuff you've been doing for Marvel as well, which obviously people I know I'm not really a Marvel guy, but people listening to this might be somewhat interested. I don't know.
Yeah, so I've been doing mostly archival books with Marvel. So I did a book that collected these very unique and special calendars that they did in the 70s and 80s. I have a book coming out in November that's about Daredevil, Born Again, the Frank Miller, Dave Mazzucchelli series. That's sort of helping launch a new line of books through Bloomsbury. I've been sort of overseeing and running like deluxe re-releases of these old Marvel editions, Origins of Marvel Comics, and some of the follow-ups. And there's a few more in that line. And I've had an imprinted image where I'm doing like my most recent book was a horror anthology called Dread the Halls, where we did one that was set at Christmas time. Dread the Halls was all Christmas horror stories. And then we did kind of a spin-off in July this past year called Dread the Hall H, which is all Comic-Con related horror stories. And so we'll be doing more of those. And yeah, little this, little that, just trying to stay busy in all different ways in the business.
Excellent. I should probably try and, even though I'm
Yeah.
sort of with a Dirt Gently focus, I should probably pick some of those up and see how your writings are, gone on over the years, over the last 10 years and what you've learned.
How it's devolved. Yeah.
I wasn't going to say that, but I try and put a positive spin, not rather than
Yeah.
saying, well, you've done other stuff. It's probably terrible, but people can
Yeah,
check
yeah.
out that one. That feels like the worst thing for an interviewer to say. So, which is why
No, but
I
look,
try
I mean,
not to say
we're talking about a comic I wrote 10 years ago. Like, I love this. I
exactly.
love that you know, liked it enough to want to have this conversation. So this is great.
Yeah, and I'm writing a big video script where I just do a look back at the comics, and maybe I can use some of this interview for it as well. Because, like I said, I had no idea that Kate Schachter was originally, going to be part of the TV series, and that's why she's introduced here. So there's a lot more of this that makes sense to me now than it did about
Yes.
30 minutes ago.
Yeah.
So yeah, yeah.
All right. Well, I
Was it?
appreciate it, man.
Was there anything questions you had for me before we left, Chris?
No, well, yeah, I guess if there was a new Dirt comic, which direction would you want it to go?
Oh, well, I know, like I said, I grew up with the Stephen Mangan show, so I'm sort of
Yeah.
used to things changing. The idea
Mm,
I had a couple of years ago when the animated series was just floated around by Arvin, it's been delayed by about COVID and writer strikes and all sorts of things. I know,
yeah.
I know the last I heard he was still working on it. Obviously, he won't talk to me anymore because I criticized him publicly with the ends of the air thing and him working with Landis again.
Mm,
But the idea I had was the animated series could be its sort of own thing, and then uh, the comics could be a sort of continuation of those characters from the show. So that way you wouldn't have to worry about the fact that everyone in the cast is like 10 years older or whatever.
yeah. Right. Yeah.
Yeah, and you could do a lot of stuff that maybe the TV show, as much as it had a high budget compared to the one in the UK that was made for peanuts, it was still a fairly low budget, well, for the most part, inexpensive show. I know they were using more and more CGI in the second season, which is again part of the reason
Yeah.
why it got cancelled, because it was very expensive to make. But uh, yeah, I think it would have been interesting because they got to do one crossover with Arvin's stories, and then it sort of came to a conclusion, and a satisfying one as well, I think. But it would have been nice just to see a little bit more of those characters. 'Cause I
Yeah.
think because I think a lot of them were left on sort of cliffhangers and such. And I think there are a lot of fans that have been trying to fill the void ever since I've been trying to direct them to the books and
Yeah,
out of the
definitely.
comics as well.
Yeah,
So yeah. But anyway, it's a lovely fandom to be part of, and
yeah, agreed.
doing my best to sort of keep it in the right, mostly in the right direction. As Arvin's been working against me in some directions, but anyways, it's lovely to talk to you, Chris, because
Yeah,
I
yeah,
have to
same.
say, this is the interview I went in of all the ones I've done knowing the least, I think. So it's been an
Mm.
education for me, and you've been really friendly and approachable. And you've also set up your background a lot better than me. I've just got my bed in the background, whereas you got all the
Yeah.
comics you worked on. So there we go.
Well, yeah, try to surround yourself with the tools of the trade.
Yeah, exactly. I mean,
Yeah.
well, I'm pretty sure there was back during the pandemic, there were a couple of our politicians that were caught with like questionable books on the bookshelf. Like somebody was caught with like
Oh,
Mein Kampf on there or something bizarre,
exactly. Yeah, you gotta curate that a little bit.
or just not have that in the first place. Yeah,
Maybe that's the better plan. Yes.
yeah. Anyway.